Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. The greatest American inventions. Today's episode carries a weight the others don't. Every invention we've discussed has transformed the world for the better, with complications sometimes, but ultimately for the better. Today's invention is more ambiguous. It carries within it both enormous promise and the shadow of annihilation. The nuclear reactor. On the afternoon of December 2nd, 1942, between the west stands of Stagg Field, the football stadium at the University of Chicago, a team of scientists gathered around a structure they'd been assembling for weeks. Chicago Pile Number 1, a stack of graphite blocks and uranium pellets designed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. The man in charge was Enrico Fermi, Italian-born, Nobel laureate, one of the greatest physicists of the century, who had fled fascist Italy with his Jewish wife in 1938 and come to America. At 2 p.m, Fermi ordered the final control rod withdrawn. Counters measuring neutron flux began clicking faster and faster. The clicking merged into a continuous roar. For 28 minutes, Chicago Pile Number 1 sustained the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in human history. It produced half a watt of power, barely enough to light a flashlight, but it proved the concept. Fermi sent a coded message. The Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. Chicago Pile Number 1 was part of the Manhattan Project, the secret program to develop atomic weapons before Nazi Germany could. The scientists involved were an extraordinary collection of minds, many of them European refugees who had fled fascism. Fermi, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr visiting under a code name, and J. Robert Oppenheimer leading the weapons design at Los Alamos. The first nuclear weapon was tested in July 1945. In August, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing between 150,000 and 250,000 people and ending World War II. The ethical dimensions of those decisions have been debated ever since, and I suspect they'll be debated forever. But the reactor also gave us something else: nuclear power. The first commercial nuclear power plant in the United States opened at Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1958. Eisenhower personally connected it to the grid. Nuclear plants use heat from fission to produce steam, drive turbines, generate electricity, with no carbon dioxide, no air pollution, and enormous energy from very small amounts of fuel. Nuclear power is, by most measures, the safest large-scale electricity source that exists. Deaths per unit of energy produced are lower than coal, lower than natural gas, lower than oil, even lower, accounting for manufacturing, than solar panels. The famous disasters, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, killed far fewer people than the routine operation of coal plants kills every year through air pollution. And yet, nuclear power is deeply feared. It carries a psychological weight that other energy sources don't. After 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986, public support collapsed. Plant construction essentially stopped in the United States. A technology that might have provided clean, reliable, abundant electricity became politically untouchable. Now, in the context of climate change, the conversation is shifting again. Small modular reactors, safer, cheaper, more flexible than the plants of the 1970s, are under development across the country. There's a growing recognition, even among some environmentalists, that getting to a zero-carbon electric grid without nuclear power is extraordinarily difficult. Enrico Fermi died in 1954 of stomach cancer at 53. The element fermium, number 100 on the periodic table, is named for him. What he demonstrated that December afternoon was a new world, one in which humanity had access to the energy locked inside the atom, a world that could be eliminated by it or destroyed by it. We are still figuring out how to live in it. Next time, we go to orbit, 12,500 miles above Earth, where a network of satellites quietly guides every navigation app on every smartphone on the entire planet. GPS. Coming up, Senator Tim Hutchinson joins me to talk about his remarkable journey from rural Arkansas to Congress, the political awakening that shaped his career, and the defining moments in public service that continue to influence his perspective on America today. That's next. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Senator Tim Hutchinson. Senator Hutchinson is a former member of the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate from Arkansas, with a career spanning more than a decade in national public service. In 1996, he made history as the first Republican ever elected by popular vote to the United States Senate from Arkansas, a milestone that reflected a broader political realignment of the state. He's a great friend. I've known him for many, many years. I'm thrilled that he's here. And he's here today to talk about his new book, From Spavinaw to D.C., A Conservative's Journey Through Faith, Farm Life, and the Fight for America, and to discuss the experiences that shaped his understanding of faith, family, public service, and the American experiment. Tim, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm honored to be with you. You referenced that 1996 Senate race. I was regularly attacked for being a foot soldier in the Gingrich Revolution, and I considered it a great honor.
Well, thank you, and apparently it didn't hurt you too badly. You wrote that you never actually thought you'd write a memoir. What finally convinced you that these stories needed to be told, and what did you learn about yourself in the process of kind of revisiting them?
Dude, I didn't think I would ever write a memoir. I looked around and I think I see a country that's highly polarized, where people are exhausted by anger. My story is a only in America kind of story. I don't think it could happen anywhere else. I think people are wanting to be reminded of who we are and that this is a great country. That's why I wrote it. And then I think it's pretty timely because of this rise in socialism in our country, because it was conservatism that attracted me as a young person to politics, and it's conservatism that's worked. So, and I'll tell you the truth, Mr. Speaker, my book really gives an insider's view of what it was like to be in the Gingrich Revolution. Through that, I came in and before the contract, the writing of the contract, and then the implementing of the contract with America. So I think it's very timely. I wanted something that was rooted in faith and humility, hopefully humility, and the belief that public service can still be honorable. It can still be a noble endeavor. So I hope that people will see the grace in the book that carried me through every chapter of my life.
You made a comment that you grew up dirt poor, but you actually didn't realize it until adulthood. Now, given the circumstances, what did your parents teach you about gratitude and hard work that really imprinted you?
Oh, well, people, they ask why Spavinaw. Well, Spavinaw was the creek that ran through our farm. And it was on that farm. I was one of 6 children. We had a big family. We didn't have anything materially, really, but we had everything that was important. We had freedom. Got up every day with 250 acres to go out and explore. And I learned a lot about freedom and hard work. We grew almost everything we ate. We had a 5-acre vegetable farm, and I had plenty of experience pulling weeds in that vegetable garden. So I learned everything that was really important. I sure learned, no offense to the politicians, but I learned a whole lot more on that farm than I did in the halls of Congress and in the committee hearings in Washington. I learned about faith. I had a pastor. I was just a kid. I think I was 10, 11 years old. He had one arm. He had lost an arm in an agricultural accident, and his name was Bruce Long. But every Wednesday after school, he would play football with a bunch of us little kids. He would invest time with us. And then after we played the football, he'd take us into the church and teach us Bible stories. Well, he impacted our life. I think we were far more interested in the football than we were the Bible stories, but the Bible stories had the lasting influence in our lives. He was a mentor, and it was during those years on the farm that I learned those lessons.
That's an interesting story. He found a way to get all of you to be excited and get together, and then he used that opportunity.
It's Arkansas. We loved football, and he knew what would attract us.
One of my favorite stories in the book is from the 1960 election when your mother supported Nixon and your father supported Kennedy. What was that like at dinner?
Well, it was a conversation that I will never forget, as that election, which was so close and so heated, and Mom, who was a rock-ribbed Republican, we'd later call her a Goldwater Republican, but she was always conservative. Dad was a nominal Democrat, grew up like so many of that generation in the Franklin Roosevelt, believing the impact he had on our country. And as they talked about it, Mom announced that she was going to vote for Nixon, and Dad said because he'd heard Kennedy had a plan to use our excess grains that was sitting in silos to help feed the world, that he had a food program that appealed to Dad. He had a huge heart and was compassionate, cared about people. And he said, I'm voting for Kennedy. And I knew that they're canceling each other out. Much later, in 96, when I ran for the Senate, and Arkansas was still a very Democratic state at that time, Dale Bumpers and David Pryor and Bill Clinton and all of them. But we used that story in a TV ad to tell people that I wasn't a harsh partisan that was just going to vote the party line. And we saw a big bump in the polls because of that story. I think it really appealed to people. But that was my mom and dad. They were pretty independent thinkers. They were politically aware, though they weren't the kind that would go out and run for office. But they always voted. They always expressed their opinion. And that made a big influence on me.
Even though the Nixon-Kennedy thing was a big moment, the real moment for you was the 1964 Republican convention at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. Why did that have such an impact on you?
I think it's a political gene that some of us have, Newt, that we just are drawn to politics. As a young teenager, I was fascinated by the political process, and I was following the campaigns. So I was very attracted to what Goldwater was saying, but it was clear that Johnson was probably going to win big. But on the eve of maybe not the eve of the election, but very soon before the election, Ronald Reagan made a nationwide address on behalf of Barry Goldwater. And he was known only as an actor at the time. He dabbled in politics, but never run for anything. But he was an incredible communicator. And I was, I guess, 14 years old, 13 or 14 years old, sitting in front of a black and white television, laying in front of the television, listening to Ronald Reagan. A famous speech now. It was a time for choosing. And I thought, as I heard Ronald Reagan, he's saying what I believe. I didn't know how to put it into words, but he was putting it into words for me. And I, next day, went down to the Republican headquarters. There weren't many of those in Arkansas in those days. I loaded up with Gold water, a little carbonated drink, loaded up with a handful of literature, and started my own campaign going door to door for Barry Goldwater. But it was really that speech. I never met Ronald Reagan. I was just a teenager. I knew Bill Clinton well, and George W. Bush on Air Force One, served with Obama and Biden. But it was Ronald Reagan, who I never met, who really was the decisive influence in my political thinking.
Now, I understand that you may have played a role in Arkansas actually going for Goldwater.
Well, I tell you, a turning point in my thinking, along with that great speech by Ronald Reagan, there was a gathering in Dallas, Texas, of evangelicals that year in Reunion Arena. Over, I think, 20,000 people gathered. And I went down to Dallas as a young man in Reunion Arena. And there, Ronald Reagan, as he was a candidate nominee for president, he spoke to that gathering. And I remember him saying, "You can't endorse me." They couldn't legally, but he said, "I can endorse you." Well, I went back home and held a Wake Up America rally, got involved. That was the year that Frank White defeated Bill Clinton for governor of Arkansas. Bill Clinton only lost 2 times in his whole political career in a general election. One of them was that year when Frank White pulled the biggest upset in the country in defeating Bill Clinton for re-election. That was the first political contribution I ever made, was to Frank White. And it wasn't much because I didn't have much, but it was a real turning point in my life as I got it. And I remember that reporter who said afterwards, he said, "You know, you deserve some credit for what you did." He said, "A lot of credit." Well, I didn't deserve much credit, but it was a turning point in my thinking that maybe I could play a bigger role politically than what I'd played in the past.
You're entering a Republican Party, which is still a distinct minority, but it's beginning to grow in that period.
It is. My brother and I, Asa, became chairman of the Republican Party, would later serve in Congress and a number of other positions, as well as governor of Arkansas. But in those days, when I was in the state legislature, there were 9 of us out of 100 in the Arkansas House. It was a slow transformation. Arkansas really lagged the rest of the South. Your state of Georgia turned much sooner than Arkansas did. And there are probably a number of reasons for that, but I'd like to think we were certainly the pioneers in those days. And when it turned quickly, but it came through a lot of really hard effort in the trenches.
How much of your effort was getting voters to support you personally, and how much was trying to convince people to consider voting Republican?
You know, the Democratic tradition in Arkansas ran so deep, as it did all through the South. And so, but Arkansans also like to vote for the person, the personality, the person they trust, as opposed to just voting straight party. We voted for Goldwater when he ran for president. We also voted for Rockefeller that year, and we voted for J.W. Fulbright, all in the same election year. They'll figure that one out. But they do tend to vote for the person that they get to know and the person they trust. So retail politics, especially back then, really mattered. Shaking hands, meeting people, and getting them to trust you. So our job was to say, look, I'm a Republican, but look beyond the label and get to know me. I remember I had a county chairman, and I made my speech, but he called me over and he laid hands on my head and he said, "See," he turned to the audience. He said, "See, there are no horns." Well, that was our job, to show that, hey, Republicans, you can take a chance on one. And they took a chance on me in 1996.
That's interesting, because when you think about it, you're right at a cusp of transition. I mean, Bill Clinton wins once and then loses, and then has to come back from defeat. So the state's sort of in transition in that period.
Yeah, I got to give a lot of credit to Mike Huckabee. Mike was coming along at the same time that my brother and I was, and had a big impact on the change in the state. When the Clinton defeat after his first term as governor was, I got to say, Newt, it was kind of an aberration. We had a great candidate in Frank White. He was a phenomenal retail politician. And Bill Clinton had made a bunch of mistakes. He brought in a lot of very liberal advisors. They had raised taxes all over the place. And it was as if Arkansas was slapping him on the hand and saying, enough, we're going to teach this whippersnapper something about the way we think. So Arkansas, though it was at that time very, very Democratic, we always said if you win the Democratic primary, that's tantamount to election. Well, it was very Democratic, but it was also very, very conservative. And eventually people said, conservative does not equate to being a Democrat today. And the state began to change very quickly.
I always thought that losing that race really set the stage for him to decide that he had to work with us when we won in 94. That he'd seen what happened if he had stonewalled us and defended liberalism, he probably would have gotten beat in 96.
Yeah, and as you recall, the first 2 years as president, he did repeat a lot of the mistakes he made his first 2 years as governor, where his popularity fell dramatically and they had big losses, as you well know, when we took the majority in 94. I remember talking to I'm not going to give his name, but a high advisor of Bill Clinton. And he said, Bill Clinton is like the blind man who walks into a room, can't see any of the furniture, stumbles over everything, but he immediately memorizes where everything in the room is, and he never has a problem again. Well, Clinton is a quick learner, and he learned that he had to work with Republicans, that he couldn't take that far left agenda and ram it through. So I credit you as much as anything because of your long days of negotiation. Last time the federal budget was balanced was under your leadership in the House. Let me just take a moment to praise you because you would lecture us on messaging. You would talk to us about the importance of learning and reading. And then you worked us to death that first 100 days after we took control. But that is, I think, what forced President Clinton into the position he was willing to negotiate, triangulate, as they said.
He'd invited me to come down when they did the Arafat-Begin meeting on the White House lawn. And then they had a reception, and he took me upstairs to the Lincoln bedroom, and we were standing on the balcony. And he turns to me just out of nowhere and says, I'm like that clown that has sand in its bottom, and when you hit it, it goes down, and then it comes back up. He said, I'm not all that pretty, but I do come back up. I thought in some ways that was as honest a statement from Clinton as I ever heard.
He earned that name, the comeback kid. Knock him down and he'll bounce back up. As we saw, he was a very gifted politician.
When we come back, we'll shift into the Washington years, what it was like stepping into Congress, and learning how the institution really operates from the inside. When you got to Congress, how did that feel? I mean, here you are, you come out of a small town in Arkansas. You've always had this dream of being involved in politics, and now you're there.
I remember they had a big dinner for all the freshmen. We had a pretty big class, and they had a meeting at Statuary Hall, and the Marine Band came and played and violins at every table, and I was just in awe. And then they escorted us down to the Senate leaders, to Bob Dole's suite, and he greeted all of us. I was for a farm kid from Arkansas, it was really, really overwhelming. But I was so excited to be there, and I wanted to be a congressman who didn't just do constituent service, but who really made a difference in national policy. I remember I worked a lot with Rod Grams. I'm sure you remember Rod because he went over to the Senate. He was from Minnesota. And we working with the Heritage Foundation, introduced a budget bill. And the Democrats still in control. And they had a budget hearing and invited any member who wanted to come in and testify about the budget could. So Rod Grams and I said, okay, let's go do it. So I remember sitting there and we gave our presentation about the plan to balance the federal budget. And the chairman got so mad, he started wagging his finger at us. His face got red. I mean, the veins were bulging, and he lectured. He said, as if to say, how dare you freshmen come in here and tell us, we who have been here, senior members, to tell us that you got the answer to balancing the budget. He really dressed us down. He was furious. And we're leaving it. One of my staff said, you okay? I said, I found it rather engaging. I loved it. And Rod loved it. And that was just the spirit that you had instilled in us, that we didn't just have to be the permanent minority. And we had hope that we could change things.
You tell one story in the book that I never knew about, that a bunch of you guys got together as freshmen and you called yourselves Cracker Jacks. I literally had never heard this.
Jack Kingston, congressman from Georgia, kind of was the inspiration for the name. Group of us, I don't know, 20 of us probably, 15 to 20 of us would gather on a nightly basis, talk about, well, how could our big freshman class influence our conference. And Jack would always bring the Cracker Jacks. We became known as the Cracker Jacks. And finally, what we decided, the place that we could make a real difference is to get the freshman class represented in the leadership team. And we voted for Mike Crapo to be the freshman class representative. And you brought him in and allowed our group of freshmen to have somebody in the leadership. I think it was very smart on your part, but we felt pretty important because we were able to get a voice.
It's important to have everybody in the room talking things through and listening to each other. However, you were doing a great job. I thought you had a great future in the House. And then you write that in the summer of 1996, a single phone call changed the course of your life. What was that about?
Well, I was very happy in the House. I had the only safe Republican seat in Arkansas. We had a whole strange set of circumstances that happened in the state that changed the political landscape. Our governor had been indicted for Whitewater-related crimes, let me put it that way. He was eventually forced to step down. Mike Huckabee, who had won a special election as lieutenant governor, was suddenly elevated to be the governor. Huckabee had already announced that he was going to run for the Senate to replace the retiring David Pryor. Well, all of a sudden, Mike Huckabee finds himself the governor, and he thinks, this isn't a bad gig. I think I'll stay governor. He drops out of the Senate race. So we are in June, past the primary date, and we don't have a candidate. And they look around, they landed on me. Well, I didn't want to do it. They were putting up quite a bit of pressure on me, and I announced publicly that I'm staying in the House. I loved the House. I loved my friends in the House and loved what I could do. They didn't quit. And I got a call from Trent Lott. And Trent, he starts putting the sell on me that I need to do this. And then he took the phone and he had to be 20 Republican senators, took that phone and made their individual appeals to be our nominee. And then they gave it back to Trent. And I said, Senator Lott, let me see if I understand what you're saying. You're wanting me to give up a safe seat in the House to run for the United States Senate, where Arkansas has never elected a Republican to the Senate in its 160-year history. And you want me to run against the sitting Attorney General who has won 7 straight statewide elections. Have I got the picture right? And he says, Tim, you did not come to Washington to occupy a safe seat. You came to Washington to help change America. Well, at that point, he had me pulled right in, and I held a press conference, changed my announcement, announced I was going to run. They held a special state convention and nominated me, and things fell together beautifully.
How did that election go?
It's interesting because it was a tough year in Arkansas. Bill Clinton was the Democratic nominee, and he was immensely popular in the state. George Herbert Walker Bush was blasting the state every day, saying what a terrible state we were and what a terrible job Bill Clinton had done as governor. And so I'm thinking, boy, I've got a balancing act here. I've got to be a loyal Republican, but it's tough because they're going after the state like they were. Toward the end of the campaign, I got to say, we had pulled even by Labor Day. We were, I think, 14 points behind when I got the nomination. We pulled even by Labor Day. And then toward the end, Bill Clinton came in and held a rally for my opponent up in Fayetteville in northwest Arkansas. We won pretty convincingly. By my calculations, I think it was like 15 to 20% of people who voted for Bill Clinton also voted for me. I can't fully explain that, except God had to be in it.
Yeah, but nonetheless, it was also part of what was happening in the state, that he, in some ways, was the last stand of the Democratic order. Now, what was it like to go from being a House member to being a senator?
Well, Speaker, I love the House. And even after I got to the Senate, I'd say I'm a House guy. And we used to say that, House guy, Senate guy. And we always said the Senate's the place that people go. It's the retirement home down at the other end of the Capitol where nothing moves and good bills go to die. And I missed the House. I had far deeper, closer friendships in the House than I developed in the Senate. I think it shouldn't be that way. The institutions are so dramatically different. I remember Don Nichols pulling me aside and he said, Tim, you're in the Senate now. You've got power. You can offer amendments on anything. You can put holds on bills, but pick your committee carefully and pick your issues carefully, because as one senator, you can make a big difference. So the House, we built coalitions. We had caucuses. We had lots of caucuses. And it was by working with your colleagues and building coalitions that you could get something done. In the Senate, it was more like all these stovepipe empires. And it was different. It was very different. I think both of them, our founders were very wise to develop our bicameral system as they did, but they're very different institutions. And I have a lot of love and respect for both of them.
I've always told audiences that if you really want to understand the difference, the House is essentially a truck stop and the Senate is a country club. And they're treated that way. House members all just kind of wander around and they don't expect to have anybody treat them special. I had several friends who would leave the House and within a week you'd call over and the staff would say, well, the senator will be available in a few minutes. And you're thinking, I know this guy for 25 years. What do you mean, the senator? But the Senate does a great job of acculturating you to be a senator.
Yeah, it's a more easier transition than others, I think. But the House is truly the people's. It's the people's institution. And they're every 2-year elections, they're close. They have to stay close to their constituents. But it's lively, it's loud, it's raucous. It's everything the Senate's not. We need a place to slow legislation down. Maybe they've slowed it down to a stop. And I do believe this, Newt. The Senate has become, in some respects, too much like the House. Because for a variety of reasons, but mostly the hyperpartisanship, the idea of doing away with the filibuster, and some of the attitudes and the hyperpartisanship, which is part and parcel of being in the House, has gotten so bad in the Senate. I think that's a very bad trend. We're seeing it become too much like the House.
Coming up, we'll close this conversation by looking ahead at America's future, the next generation, and which lessons from a life in public service still matter today. Let me ask you a little bit about the future and the next generation. You describe your 2 trips to Israel, one as a House member, one as a senator, as really having deeply affected you. What was there about going to Israel that got through to you?
Well, as a Christian who really depended upon God in a lot of these kind of risky steps that I took, the run for the House, the run for the Senate, even the writing of this book, I had faith. But to go to the Holy Land and to walk where Jesus walked, to go to the Dead Sea, to ride a boat on the Sea of Galilee, to see baptisms in the Jordan River, and to go to what used to be called the Wailing Wall, but the wall of where prayers are offered by the Jewish faithful. It is such a moving and gripping experience. You can't see life the same, and you sure can't see the scriptures the same. It had a deep and profound impact upon me, and I know that travel by members of Congress is frowned upon. I think it's sad that it is such an important part of taking somebody from the Ozark Hills and giving them the opportunity to see a broader view of the world and of geopolitics. It was enormously valuable. I talk about a few of those experiences in the book, but I think it's also the way in which Republicans and Democrats can actually get to know each other as human beings on those trips, as opposed to just seeing them as a political enemy.
In that context also, you seem to have been deeply influenced by your trip to China and what you experienced there.
Yeah, I've been to China twice, 20 years apart. I went in 2000 when I'd gone to the Senate. it had been instilled in me that free markets were the way to change China. My biggest corporate constituent in Arkansas was, probably still is, Walmart. And the Walmart people basically made the argument at the time that if we will open trade and we will trade more, and that they will see the benefits of capitalism, and capitalism will lead to democratization. And I didn't see that happening. And I was really horrified by the way Christians were treated in China. The close surveillance, the churches had to be registered by the state, that today they actually have cameras photographing everybody sitting in those pews. That left a deep impact on me. When I went back 20 years later, I saw that while technology and capitalism, in their version of capitalism, had flourished and prosperity had increased, that the oppression of the people was as great as ever, and technology was actually being used as a tool of the government to oppress their people. I would try to go to the Senate floor every year on the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre to remind people of just what kind of government the communist regime in Beijing is. So, yes, I remember this last time I went to China, we went to a university where a professor of American history lectures, and they had a lot of former members were there, several. Questions were asked, most of them very innocuous. Nobody wanted to offend the Chinese. And I said, Professor, do you feel free right now in this classroom to criticize your government? And he looked around. He said, I don't think we have any cameras in here. I almost always have a monitor present with me when I'm talking. He said, I have had to go through re-education once already in my life. He said, I think I've set it up. And as I left, I asked, can he get in trouble for what he said? He said, he's right on the edge, right on the edge. So, 20 years of improved technology only meant better oppression by the communist government. So, yes, China, I talk about in the book. I used to have dissidents, people who'd been imprisoned for their faith, come by my office regularly and thank me for speaking up for the Chinese people. I think they are not just, as some say, a competitor. They are one of our greatest threats.
I have to ask you one personal thing, which, again, I didn't know about you. You're really a pretty passionate golfer.
I love golf, and I have such memories of my golfing with my father and my brothers. We would make a foursome, and my dad wasn't a great golfer, but he loved the game. I never had time to golf when I was in Congress. I used to go out with Tom Ewing and Pete Hoekstra. After the session was over, we'd go out to Andrews and we'd golf. And when I finally got out of the Senate, I had time to really start golfing. But I talk about the friends that you make on the golf course. You can't tell whether that guy with you is a corporate executive or the janitor down the street. It was very equalizing in that sense, but some great, great memories on the golf course.
But you talk about your early golf was with your father's hickory-shafted clubs. What was it like to play with those old-time wooden clubs?
I still have some of them. I would like to see some of the pros today golf with the clubs that Sam Snead had to hit with back in the day. But yeah, it was some great, great memories and some great experiences. I had the opportunity to go some really wonderful courses and make some great friends. I remember Senator Feingold, who was a senator from Wisconsin, and as far left as I was right. I was the most conservative senator. He was probably the most liberal senator. And he came up to me on the floor of the Senate and he said, Tim, I hear you like golf. I said, I do like golf. He says, well, I do too. He says, you and I ought to go out and golf together. And I said, I would love to do that. He says, well, I only have one rule. I won't go to a private country club. I only go to public golf courses. I said, that's okay with me. We never did get to play that game, but at the public golf course that I regularly attended, if they heard I was a former senator, they said, did you know Russ Feingold? I said, yeah, I knew Russ. He says, well, he used to golf out here on this public golf course. So it's a way of bringing people together. and there's a good camaraderie that goes with golf.
I have one last question. How will you be spending the 4th of July on America's birthday?
I'm going to be with my family on Bald Head Island, so it's a family gathering, and we will have a lot of toast to America. They have a great fireworks display, but we will also, as a family, have a lot to be thankful for, and we'll be toasting this great country.
That's great. Tim, I want to thank you for joining me, and your new book, From Spavinaw to D.C., A Conservative's Journey Through Faith, Farm Life, and the Fight for America, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much, Speaker.
Thank you to my guest, Senator Tim Hutchinson. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.